initially the title of this role that I've taken on was actually Type 1 Sports Academy. I think that title is changing, so I want to talk to you a little bit about the role, which is going to be activity and type 1 diabetes. So just to give you a little bit of background to the role, Julia Platt set up a steering group last year called Type 1 Sports Academy to look at improving resources and improving resources for people who want to be more active with type 1 diabetes. And as part of that, there was lots of different opinions and lots of different advice being given. So she's asked somebody to lead it. So I've been lucky enough to get a session a week to lead on this. So as a background, if we think about activity and diabetes, is we know that most of the population we deal with are more inactive. We've got a small population that are moderately active, and then we've got a very small population that are very active. We don't have any stats for Wales, but if you look across the rest of the world, we know that people with diabetes are more likely to be less active than people without diabetes. So diabetes is an additional barrier to activity. So one of the first things I've done, so I started this role middle of January, so really early days at the moment. And I'm really lucky to have had advice from experts like Jill, patient representatives like Paul, and the pre-existing steering group that had started before I began the role. And what we came up with, and this is literally just hot off the press, something that through the feedback I had from the group, was that actually the aim of the role will be to empower healthcare professionals and people with diabetes, with type 1 diabetes, to achieve their personal activity goals. And I think this breaks down some of the barriers that the title Type 1 Sports Academy had, which sounded like it was going to be quite an elitist resource or something that was going to appeal to a certain proportion of the population. So as part of starting, one of the first things that AUDIG, who are funding the role, have asked me to do, and bear in mind this isn't a paediatric specific role, it's going to cover both paediatric and adult services, is look at what is out there in terms of resource for people living with diabetes. So what we can see is there are lots of public health resources available to encourage people to be more active, but they're not actually type 1 specific. Compared to other places in the UK, actually in Wales we're doing pretty well. The launch of Serenactive has been excellent. We delivered our first Serenactive session last week and it was absolutely amazing. We've got some really good health board specific resources. So Nair and Bevan have always led the way when it comes to physical activity and type 1 diabetes. There's some really good company resources out there. So Libra are doing really good information packets around living with type 1 diabetes. And then there's lots of kind of other resources out there. So we've got Rextod, DigiBeats, things like that. And then we've got, in Wales, we're really lucky, we've got patient resources, people who are writing blogs. We've got Paul does his blog online. And then we've got some amazing academic resources. So if you want to learn all about the Krebs cycle and GLUT4 inhibitors, you can go online and find these like mind-blowing DVDs which explain to you what's happening when it comes to physical activity and diabetes. And at the steering group last week, or a couple of weeks ago, we spent quite a lot of time looking at what resources are there, and actually more and more gets added. So there's lots there, but why is there this big gap between resources that are available for people living with diabetes? You know, why is there a gap? Why is there an additional barrier to people living with diabetes? And what we found, and what I found looking at the scoping document really, is that actually the gaps are that motivating people and raising the topic of being physically active is an issue for healthcare professionals. And from chatting to my colleagues around Wales, is sometimes that's not always culturally possible to bring up the topic of being more active. A lot of my colleagues are feeding back that they don't feel confident as healthcare professionals to talk about some of the intricacies around sports and diabetes, around being more active. They get a little bit overwhelmed when it comes to topics like aerobic and anaerobic activity, and that there's a little bit of a gap in terms of education there. Patients aren't feeling that confident. They sometimes have experienced hypos quite early on, and that puts them off physical activity, and that acts as an additional barrier to change. And whilst there's lots of gaps within the paediatric world, there's a massive gap in adult resources across Wales. And what's really hit home is there's a big knowledge deficit. As dietitians, we're often very interested in sports nutrition. A lot of my nursing colleagues are very interested in sports nutrition. A lot of the medical colleagues are, but we don't have much formal training within the network in Wales. So we've got quite a few dietitians who might have done the sports and exercise nutrition course. Other than that, seems to be a lack of kind of formal training or formal kind of guidance around what would a very educated person doing working with sports and diabetes look like. And there is also a massive lack of support for kind of high level athletes, and that's inequitable to what we see in other parts of England, where they can access kind of very specialist clinics which will look just at the sports and diabetes. In some centres, they've got really highly skilled staff, but in other centres they don't, and we don't have that ability to cross-refer that in the way that they do in other places. And thinking about training deficit, what's come up with these specialist centres is either, if they're looking at sports and diabetes, is either they're very expensively run, so they're a big MDT, so they've got a consultant, a dietitian, a nurse, or they're nursing and or dietetic run, but the nursing and or the dietitian have got a prescribing, I've got their prescribing certificate. And that kind of raises that, don't mention the war about prescribing and dietitians and prescribing and nurses, because that creates a whole other issue. But actually the whole theory behind managing exercise and insulin involves adjusting our insulin doses. So we should be maybe thinking about this. It should be another thing to think about in terms of prescribing for allied healthcare professionals. So I was really lucky. There was a pre-existing steering group which consisted of interested health professionals, academics and patient representatives. So I thought, oh, brilliant, I can get all of their ideas and then we can come up with a really, really solid project. But actually I was like SpongeBob SquarePants, because when you think about sports or being active and diabetes, it's actually a massive area, and that could have taken, I could probably develop a £10 million project over the next 20 years if we took on board everything that needs to be considered. So for now, I think it's a really complicated area. I've been really grateful for the advice I've had from people. I think the next steps that we're going to take, first of all within my role and then potentially as a steering group, is to start talking about the gaps in service. So we don't often talk about the fact that we don't have a high level clinic. We use the resources we have and we try and deliver what we can. But I think it's really important to highlight to the powers that be that we don't have much resource. Try and streamline conversations. So actually, where are the biggest gaps and what can we do now? As a starting point, one of the first things I want to do is, we've got Serenactive Active for Paediatrics, is come up with some resource that we can actually get out to our adult colleagues. And then in the longer picture is try and develop something that will help us in the MDT to feel more skilled and more empowered to manage activity and diabetes. So an idea that I'm exploring at the moment is the idea of an online training module. I don't know if people have access CDEP, but something along those lines. If anyone's got any ideas and wants to share them, then please do. And also, quite excitingly, not specifically related to this, but Paul Coker's developed an app, and that's hopefully going to become, am I allowed to share that?
Yep.
Yeah, that's hopefully going to be coming out soon, which should be a really useful patient resource to kind of give advice about how you could adjust your insulin depending on the type of activity you're doing and depending on some of the other factors, such as what you've eaten, what your day's been like, what your blood glucose is. So it's quite an exciting app in development.